Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this European Social Survey seminar. I hope you're all keeping well during these very difficult times. So this is our first sort of substantive seminar back after the break. And we're going to look tonight at an issue that has been covered by the European Social Survey in one of our recent waves. So before I introduce our speaker, we're just going to very quickly, as a framing exercise, remind you a little bit about what the European Social Survey did in this area, just as an entree to our speaker's talk. Okay, so this was the question that we asked in Wave 8 as part of the welfare module. So the respondents were given a bit of framing, and they were essentially told a little bit about what a basic income scheme would actually involve. And they were asked to give their favour or opposition on a 4-point scale. So it was very simple. So very, very briefly, just as a framer for you, there was quite a lot of variation across countries in the proportion of the respondents who said that they backed basic income scheme. A lot of variation across the participant countries. There was also variation between age groups. So in each of these little welfare regime clusters, broadly speaking, people at the younger end of the distribution were more supportive. You'll notice that in some of these clusters, it's actually reasonably flat. It's not what you'd call a massive age gradient. So we can also look at this, split this in terms of income. So again, in the Christian democratic countries, support was higher at the bottom end of the distribution of income. But again, across the different welfare regimes, it's not something that you'd say was a very consistent income gradient, reasonably flat. Next slide. And we also did this for left, centre and right on the self-evaluation question that's included in the ESS. And again, in Christian democratic and Eastern European countries, you'd have to say that this is essentially a flat distribution, not really any great shift in terms of left, centre and right. Okay, so that's just a very brief introduction, and by way of explaining why we're so interested in the question that we're going to be hearing about tonight. So I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker. He is Daniel Nettle, who is Professor of Behavioural Science at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom. His research interests included a range of different topics related to behaviour, cognition, society and health. And at the start of the lockdown, he wrote a blog in April, in fact, called "Why is Universal Basic Income Suddenly Such a Good Idea?" So, Daniel, we look forward to hearing your talk, and you now have control.
Thank you very much. That's a dangerous thing to say, isn't it? Can people give me a sort of thumb up, or Eric, just tell me if I'm audible?
Very clear.
Thank you. That's excellent. I'm going to share my screen. Just a second. And you should now be seeing my slideshow. Eric, again, can you confirm that that's right?
Yes, seeing that.
Lovely. Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. I'll get straight into my talk because I think Eric set it up very nicely. Obviously, I'm not aware of what this audience is and sort of what kind of people it encompasses, but you may find the research you're about to see very odd. I think the reason is that I'm sort of more of an experimental psychologist than a classic sort of ESS type researcher. So you're not going to see any representative samples, and you're not going to see any great care taken with the exact kind of formulation of questions and with measurement. But I nonetheless hope that the things I'm going to show you will be of interest and will speak actually to some of those ESS issues that Eric just mentioned. Okay, and it's a sort of story with a prelude, which is what we were trying to do when the pandemic struck, which was research the cognition that underlies the formation of policy preferences, and then two studies that we've done during the pandemic period which were really fortuitous opportunities to kind of test a hypothesis that we'd been developing. So I'll tell you about those two, and I'll try and reach some kind of conclusion. There are a couple of points in the talk where I'm going to explain some data, and I'm just worried that it might be a bit obscure exactly what the analyses we've done are. So I might at that point stop and ask if people want to put things in the chat, and maybe Eric can be the mediator there. And if I need to explain things more, Eric will be able to indicate that to me. So let's just sort of start from the big picture, that the view of policy preference formation that my colleagues and I have been working on really is rather different from the kind of idea that people have fixed fundamental values that may differ from individual to individual for all kinds of, genetic and developmental reasons, but once they've got them, they're kind of set in stone like personality traits. And instead, we're trying to take a much more situational view of how people come to feel that some policy or other would be best for their society. And basically, we think there's a psychology that reads off from their experience of society a whole load of what we call situational features, like what are the nature of the threats facing my society and how serious they are, what kinds of people are in my society, are they very similar to me or are they very different, is there a war on, or is there some other crisis at work, are the people in my society getting what they've got as a result of luck or through their hard work, and so on. So we're kind of constantly computing these situational features, and the preferences we form at least partly kind of reflect those situational inputs. And the kind of strong prediction of this way of thinking about policy preferences is that when the situation of society changes in some dramatic way, people's policy preferences ought to shift really a lot. So people who've believed that X would be the best kind of policy for their society for many years actually could suddenly change that if a war broke out or a hurricane hit or something of that nature. I think you can see where I'm going to go with this. And for a bit more justification of this approach, which we've outlined, particularly in the context of people's preference for redistribution, see this paper whose reference is given there. The way we studied this, or were studying it, was to describe to people hypothetical societies. Obviously, we can't make a war break out, but what we can do is describe a society that, among other things, is at war versus in another condition, one which is the same but at peace, and then say, okay, in this society, what ought they to do? What kinds of institutions ought they to have? And again, this paper kind of talks through that hypothetical societies method. I'm not going to review the results of that now because I want to get on to the main body of my talk, but you can always look those up. The key things I want to say about that work, though, which are relevant to today, is in our experiments, people's preferences, which I remind you are not for their own society, but for these hypothetical societies we're describing, are not very consistent. And also their political orientation on the traditional left-right scale is a rather poor predictor of what they think that society ought to do. So just a couple of little graphs that show that. I know this looks like an almighty mess, but this is the same respondents, for 20 respondents, their responses to 4 different hypothetical societies we just described. It doesn't matter how they differed. They differed, one was at peace and one was at war and some other things like that. And the variable on the vertical axis is the preferred level of redistribution, the level of redistribution they thought would be all right for that society, from 100% everything is redistributed in the village to 0%, there's just a private property system. And the individual lines are the responses of individual participants. And the only reason I show this graph is to show you that someone who is a total communist for one village, thinks nearly 100% of stuff should be socialized, for the very next village that we describe to them, think there should be no welfare system at all, but everyone should just keep their harvest. So most people are really labile on this, which strikes against the view that, we all just have tastes or preferences and these are somehow fixed. And then just this other graph is to illustrate the same point, that when we ask the people to set a preferred level of redistribution for these hypothetical societies, their left to right political orientation predicts their average response in the way you would imagine. People who see themselves as more left-wing want these societies to redistribute a bit more, but it's a really weak effect. So the situational signal, which is we vary features of the society and people's responses change, hugely dwarfs the individual differences signal coming from their left to right political orientation, which is also there, but it's much, much weaker. Okay, so we were merrily trying to research this and we're designing experiments. And then a pandemic happened. We thought, oh, look, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? If our model is right, this huge, unexpected external threat that's changing in a very core way, the situation of the societies we live in, really should lead to a big difference in people's policy preferences. It's a strong test of our general approach. I mean, even without making any strong predictions about what those changes would be, we just think that people will say, oh, everything's different now. We need to do things differently. And of course, if you all cast your minds back to sort of March and April, the news and the newspapers were full of, oh, we can never go back to how we were, all bets are off. All of the things we thought we needed to do, like pay down the deficit, we can just forget about now. We need to do something completely different. And we thought, well, this is quite good. This sort of fits with our general expectations. A nice thing about thinking about the pandemic in research terms is, if you look in the literature, there are really competing ideas out there about what the impact of the pandemic will be, particularly on systems of social solidarity, so things like welfare systems. On the one hand, there's this very sort of optimistic narrative, which David Graeber, for example, writes about here. In the immediate wake of great disasters, a flood, a blackout, a pandemic, people tend to behave the same way, reverting to a rough and ready communism. However briefly, hierarchies and markets and the like become luxuries that no one can afford. Anyone who's lived through such a moment, and we all just have, can speak to their peculiar qualities, the way that strangers become sisters and brothers, and human society itself seems to be reborn. Now, I'm sure you all remember back in April, all of these articles saying, I suddenly loved my neighbors and wondered why I cared so much about how much money I took home. And, this has reminded me that relationships are much more important than personal wealth and so on. Maybe that's kind of attenuated a bit over time, but I definitely understand what David Graeber is writing about here. But on the other hand, in the anthropological literature, the exact opposite view is also abundantly represented. For example, that Colin Turnbull's famous ethnography, The Mountain People, which is written about a village that was facing famine, basically said, well, society broke down. Systems of redistribution just stopped existing. Society itself stopped existing. And he concluded that far from being basic human qualities, things like generosity and fairness are superficial luxuries we can afford in times of plenty. But given the situation in which the people he was studying, found themselves, man has not time for such luxuries, and a much more basic man appears using much more basic survival tactics. So his kind of intuition here was, when things are tough, when it's a matter of life and death, our solidarity for other people and our requirement that they be helped goes out the window, and we just want to keep our stuff for ourselves. So these two kind of views really license very different predictions about what the impact of the pandemic would be on, for example, our support for government spending and redistribution. To no, I just want to keep my income to myself. To yes, we think governments should redistribute. Now, another thing you might have noticed back in April and May is a rash of articles about universal basic income, in which, I mean, this slide actually says everything you need to know. People were suddenly saying, this pandemic changes my thinking on universal basic income. It seems to make a good idea to, makes a lot more sense to us now. And all kinds of people started to say that. The guy Standing, who's a sort of famous expert on universal basic income, said, my phone was ringing off the hook. I've never been busier. Everyone wants to talk about universal basic income. And it was widely reported that the Spanish government, with their minimum income scheme, had introduced the universal basic income. In fact, the scheme that has been introduced in July is very far from that. But nonetheless, it's a novel kind of unconditional scheme of income support. Anyway, we thought, well, this is interesting. Is this a sort of test case for our idea that the change in the situation might change people's cognition about whether a policy is a good idea? Because universal basic income, although recently surveys seem to suggest it has high levels of popular support, that varies a bit between countries, as we've seen, to many people in the policy world, is an unsaleable policy. And it's unsaleable because they feel that it violates some really basic principles, one of which is you should only help people who are in need. Like I think humans are very open to the idea of helping others, but they feel that help should go to those in need. And they also feel that people, to take a benefit should pay a cost of some kind, should sort of demonstrate their their worthiness or their effort, so that the whole unconditionality of UBI is intuitively very odd to people. And they say, well, that's not right. Why should surfers receive my tax dollars and so on? So it's sort of interesting to us that lots of people were saying, well, this didn't make sense to me before, but it's making sense to me now. Why would that be? Why would that cognition have changed, given that the way the world has changed? Okay, so I'm going to present a couple of studies we've done in the last few months. And these were the research questions. Does the existence of the pandemic increase support for a universal basic income scheme relative to there not being one? So just basically the question in a way that the ESS asked back in wave 8. And then a slightly different question, that when you pit in people's choices a UBI against an equally generous targeted welfare scheme, is the unconditionality particularly attractive for this time of the pandemic? So you might favor a UBI just because you're in favor of any welfare scheme that's going, or you might particularly like its unconditionality as compared to an equally generous targeted scheme. And more generally, we're interested in the cognition underlying that. What is it about the pandemic that's made UBI more attractive if it has? And generally, how does what we think about the features of a policy relate to our overall level of endorsement of it? So, when we endorse a policy and say, that sounds a good idea, is it actually because we've got a really systematic and rich set of inferences about what's good about the policy and why therefore it should be good? Or do we just like the person who proposed it, or it's proposed by people who look a bit like us, or some sort of less cognitively sophisticated kind of reason? And then just a little bit, I'll talk about how do the effects of the pandemic on UBI preference attenuate over time. And I've got some new data from this week just to show you on that score. Okay, so our first study was initially done on the 7th of April, 2020. These are just opportunity samples. This is people who are signed up to a crowdsourcing website for social science research. So they're not nationally representative samples, but they were reasonably large and actually reasonably diverse from the US and the UK. And also, in all of these studies, we're not really trying to make strong claims about the absolute level of support for UBI because our samples might not be nationally representative. We're really making claims about how that support shifts when you talk to people about the context of the pandemic. So it's a within individual comparison that I think is the strongest suit of our studies. So we asked people to express support for universal basic income, explained in similar wording to the way the ESS used it. And we asked them to do this twice. We once said, thinking about normal times, as if this pandemic had not happened, would you support the introduction of a UBI? And then we said, and now thinking about these times when the pandemic has happened and the times of the pandemic and its aftermath, what level of support would you have for the introduction of a UBI? So it's the difference between those two that's primarily of interest here. We also gave 9 advantages and disadvantages of a universal basic income scheme. These are the kind of ones that have been discussed in the literature, and we'll come back to those. And we wanted the participants to rate both how true those things were of UBI, which they all were. So participants sort of recognize the advantages and disadvantages that are discussed in the literature of this policy. But we also said, how important is this consideration in your overall support? How important is it for a normal world, a world where the pandemic hadn't, and how important is it now? So by seeing the shift in importance, we can get some sense of how people are thinking about the change that there's been with the pandemic. We also had a bunch of socio-demographic information, which I'll only briefly touch on today. So from what I'm telling you about now, we had 400 UK and 400 US participants. It was a gender balanced sample. It was a reasonably wide range of ages. These are all adults. And when you ask people to put themselves on a left to right political scale, it was a somewhat left leaning sample, but it had actually a pretty good range. So left is closer to 1 and right is closer to 100. And you see that the mean was at 40 odd in the UK and 35 in the US. So headline results in panel A here. Remember, we've asked people, how much do you support this? Would you support the introduction of such a policy for normal times as if the pandemic hadn't happened, and for these pandemic times and their aftermath? And I hope you can see there. So that's just so the white box is a box plot. The thick bar in it is the median. And you can see that first we get a pretty high level of support in this sample for UBI, even for normal times, but it really goes up a lot for the pandemic. So to really, that we have very strong endorsement. This will be a great idea for the pandemic times. And panel B just breaks that out by the UK and the USA sample, and they just look uncannily similar to each other. There's no difference. In fact, we find almost no difference between the UK and US participants in any feature of this study, which is perhaps rather surprising. So we get the same effect size of shift in both countries. We thought, oh, this is sort of interesting. Is this some sort of response to the world has gone crazy, nobody knows what's happening, everyone just needs help and they need it unconditionally now? So an interesting question is, will that attenuate over time? So as I was preparing the talk this week, I reran the UK side of this survey in another couple of hundred participants from the same participant pool. So these were not the same individuals. And of course, the composition of the participant pool could have changed a bit over time. I can't eliminate that, but I just thought it would be an interesting exercise. And so there you see the data for the UK by April and September sampling. And you see that the pattern is basically the same. People think UBI is a much better idea for pandemic times than for normal times, but the effect size has attenuated. Back in April, it was 0.8 of a standard deviation. By September, it's only 0.5. That's an attenuation of a third in 6 months, which is interesting. And it certainly squares with my intuition that, I thought, oh, gosh, this pandemic changes everything in the most fundamental ways. And now we're saying, well, there's actually a few ways it perhaps hasn't changed things quite as much. And, that initial kind of feeling is slightly kind of attenuating. Okay. Interestingly, this is back to the April data. This increase in support is seen right across the political spectrum. So we find that UBI is a policy that is slightly more endorsed by people who see themselves on the left than on the right. That's not terribly surprising, but really wherever you are on the political spectrum, you think it's a better idea now than in pandemic times than you thought it was in normal times. These are just linear fits through the data for the two countries. Now, this is the bit that I hope I will explain adequately well. So remember we asked about these 9 advantages and disadvantages, or these 9 things that could be true about UBI. And we said, how important are these considerations? For example, that it's efficient and simple, that it reduces stress and anxiety, that it's expensive, that it could go to people who don't deserve it, or that people might reduce their labor force participation. And there's a lot of ways that you can things you can read from this graph. So these are just box plots, and normal times is in red and pandemic times is in green. So if you just look at the normal times data, first of all, remember this is a sample of people who were really quite pro UBI, and they said, look, it's really important for a social policy that it be efficient and simple and that it reduce stress and anxiety. And then things like, is it important that it goes to people who are undeserving, or it goes to the rich, or that they might reduce their labor force participation? And they actually didn't think those things were quite so important. So they were really sold on the efficient and simple way of reducing stress and anxiety. But then the other thing you can do by looking at this graph is look at how the medians in the green boxes are different from the medians in the red boxes. And you can see that in these pandemic times, efficiency and simplicity and reducing stress and anxiety just really max out. Everyone says, yeah, that is really important now. It was already pretty important anyway, but they'd say that's really important. And certain other things like reduction in labor force participation just becomes totally unimportant, which is not surprised because everyone was on furlough anyway. So, the fact that they would withdraw their labor is sort of irrelevant at that point. So that's what panel A shows. Panel B, what we did is we made a regression model. So we know for each individual how important they think these considerations in choosing a social policy are. And we know their overall support for UBI. So we can make a regression model that says how well can you predict their overall support from what they think is important. This is a kind of measure of their internal cognitive coherence, right? If you think something's really important, and you think UBI fulfills that, but you don't support UBI, you have a kind of internal incoherence. And in fact, we found that we could predict people's overall levels of support pretty well from their answers to the importance of these 9 considerations. And actually in pretty much identical manner for normal times or pandemic time. You could use either set of data and you got the same result. And what this graph shows is the beta coefficients in that regression model. So for each of these 9 things that are listed on the vertical axis, how well do they positively or negatively predict that person's overall level of support for UBI? And so if you're someone who likes an efficient and simple policy, you really like UBI. So it's a positive beta coefficient. If you think reducing stress and anxiety is really important, that predicts you'll tend to favor UBI. If you think it's important that the undeserving don't receive, benefits out of your social policy, you tend not to like UBI. That shouldn't surprise us terribly much. But basically, people who like UBI like it mainly because of its efficiency and simplicity and its perceived effectiveness in reducing stress and anxiety. So why has support for it shifted? Well, it's really obvious. In the pandemic, efficiency and simplicity and reducing stress and anxiety just became much more important in people's minds. So that panel C just shows the difference between the average importance in normal times and pandemic times, and other things like, stuff going to the undeserving or reduced labour force participation became somewhat less important. And those were the things that negatively predicted support for UBI. So it really just follows as night follows day that support's going to increase because support is related consistently to the beliefs people have about what's important, and the beliefs about what's important have changed in response to the pandemic. So I hope that makes sense. Has anyone got any questions, sort of just technical questions about what this slide shows? Because maybe I could take a moment to explain more if need be. Otherwise, I'll press on, Eric.
Yes, I think so. It was clear to me.
Oh, good. Well, that's good news.
If people on reflection have any queries at the end, that we can wrap them up there.
Lovely. Okay. So that's all very well, but of course, all we've done in this study is said, do you think there should be a UBI? And people have said yes for the pandemic. That makes it, we're more strongly in favour of that. But it could just be that the pandemic makes people favourable to absolutely any generous welfare policy at all. They just want more welfare spending, and the UBI seems one way of getting it. So in study 2, what we wanted to do was say, when you're forced to trade off between a UBI and an equally generous targeted system, so does the pandemic make you veer towards the unconditionality? Well, so it's not just do you want a UBI versus nothing, but if you had to choose between a UBI and an equally generous targeted system, does the pandemic change your thinking there? So that was the reason for doing study 2. We also kind of expanded on the thing I just told you about, the 9 properties, and we said, look, we gave people 16 potentially desirable properties of a welfare system, just sort of culled from the literature, and said, how well does UBI, which of the 2 systems, UBI or targeted, better fulfills this desirable property, and how heavily do you weight each of these desirable properties? So again, we're trying to understand their beliefs about what matters and how that relates to their overall policy preferences. Again, we had some socio-demographic information. By the way, all this data is available on the Open Science Framework if people want to run other analyses in it. We also had some further questions on the consequences of the pandemic that I'll just come back to super quickly later in my talk. Again, same participant pool, same in the UK and US. Again, we have a reasonable range of ages, gender balanced samples. Again, slightly left-leaning kind of samples, but with a reasonable sort of a range. So here's the headline result. This is analogous to what I showed for study 1. If we look at panel A there, for pandemic times, again, people are doing the same thing. They're saying, what's your preference between targeted and unconditional for normal times and for pandemic times? And again, they're tending to shift more towards the universal, the UBI, for pandemic times compared to normal times. It's not as resounding a result as for study 1. Okay, so when you And this is actually known in the literature, that when you say, do you think UBI is a good idea? People say, great. And then you say, well, do you think it's a good idea that we take away means tested benefits? And they say, oh, well, now I'm not so sure. So that's the headline result there in panel A. Again, it's pretty much identical in the two countries, but it's a smaller shift than in study 1. And again, I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that has changed over time. Maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought, well, no one's any idea what's going on. Anyone could fall sick at any moment, and we really need an unconditional system of assistance. But as time has gone by, it's become clear that certain categories of people are much more at risk than others, and certain parts of the country have. So maybe over time, we would see, actually, no, the right response to this is really a targeted system. Now we know the categories of people who really need help. So I thought it would be interesting to find out if this is attenuated. So again, I ran it again yesterday, and you still find the shift in September that we found in May, but again, the effect size has attenuated by about a third. It was 0.35 of a standard deviation in May. It's 0.25 of a standard deviation in September. Attenuation by a third in 6 months. Maybe May to September is a bit less than 6 months anyway, in a few months. Okay, so back to the May data. Recall we had 16 desirable properties of a welfare system, and we said, which better fulfills this property, UBI or a targeted system? So targeted system is shown towards the 0 of this scale, and UBI towards 100. And actually on most of them, to our surprise, UBI tends to win. I guess that, that relates to the fact that there's a pretty high level of support for it in these samples we're studying. So things like simplicity of administration, UBI wins hands down. It being suitable for an unpredictable world and hard to cheat. It avoids people falling between the cracks. All these kinds of things, UBI wins hands down. Things like reducing crime, people don't have very clear intuitions about that, and actually the median's right in the middle. The one where it really loses out is it the better system for helping the needy? And people understandably say that it isn't, which you would hope would be true. If they didn't say that, I think they wouldn't have understood our survey questions, because the whole point about UBI is it isn't targeted towards the needy. So the targeted system wins really only for targeting help to the needy, which is pretty important, right? I mean, that's a pretty fundamental thing about welfare systems. But UBI actually, wins on lots of other things, including interesting ones like bringing society together and increasing well-being, which was an interesting finding. Okay. Now, again, we asked people to rate how important these different desirable properties were, and then we use that to try and predict their preference between, their level of preference between UBI and targeted. So these again are beta coefficients from a regression model where we're predicting the person's preference from targeted to UBI, which is expressed on a continuous scale, from the relative weights, the subjective weights of these various considerations. And basically, I mean, the results I thought were quite interesting, that if you like something that's simple to administer, reduces poverty, and if you weight more heavily simplicity of administration, you like UBI more, and all of those positive beta coefficients. So if you weight more heavily something that reduces poverty, you like UBI more. If you weight more heavily something that's suitable for unpredictability, you like UBI more. By contrast, if you weight more heavily something that, for example, helping the needy, the third one from the bottom, or not leading to irresponsibility, the bottom one, you actually like UBI less, and you're more interested in a targeted one. So to just remind you, we're looking at the desirable and undesirable features and how these predict overall support. And what you see is that basically the panel B shows how much more important have those particular features become for in the pandemic times. And you see that again, something being simple to administer and it being suitable for unpredictable times becomes much more important in people's minds as a sort of reason for that policy. And other things like it not leading to irresponsibility kind of go by the wayside. So we were able to predict, the shift that occurred was kind of predictable, given that the things that predicted you would support UBI in normal times have just become more important to many people. So it sort of follows inevitably that what happened would happen. Okay, just want to give you a little bit more information. I told you that we asked some additional questions about the consequences of the pandemic, and this allowed us to drill into something we found in both studies, which is the simplicity of administration of a policy seemed to have become more important in people's minds with the pandemic. And so we asked people to rate agreement with certain statements that allowed us to sort of drill into why would simplicity suddenly be so important. And so things like, because of the pandemic, people can't afford the delays caused by bureaucracy, or because of the pandemic, it's hard for the government to assess people's need. Because of the pandemic, it's stressful for people to have to demonstrate their need. And we basically found really high levels of endorsement with that. So the reason that simplicity seems to come into the play, and in this situation, is that, people can't afford to wait, and it's going to be really hard to do a more complex need-based system. So the appeal of just saying everyone will get a check every month, becomes overwhelming. Also, we found increased importance was accorded by people in both studies to reducing stress and anxiety through public policy in this time. And on the face of it, it's not really clear why that would lead to increased support for UBI, because you might say, well, they should just make the benefits to the existing benefit claimants more generous rather than be unconditional. But of course, it depends who you think is being stressed by the pandemic. So we asked, for whom has the pandemic increased stress and anxiety? People who were previously receiving state benefits, or those who were not previously receiving state benefits? And pretty clearly, people believe that those whose stress and anxiety has really most increased are those who were not in receipt of any state benefits, right? So it makes sense that you wouldn't want to just make the existing system more generous, because the problem is not so much that the people who were already being helped by the previous system, having a more stressful time, so you need to help them more. It's that everyone else who wasn't being helped by the system, didn't previously need to be helped by it, suddenly is having a much more stressful time. So it would make sense, you wouldn't want to make the existing targeted system just more generous or more forgiving or something. What you want to do is bring into an umbrella a much, much wider group of people. So that is interesting, and in a way relates to some kind of theoretical ideas about welfare systems, that really our intuitions about these depend a lot on who you think you're trying to help. Is there like a small subgroup of people who are victims of sort of historic bad luck, like the disabled, or people who in some other way have need to be compensated for the fact that life's dealt them a tough deal? Or in fact, is who you're trying to help everybody, right? Is everybody in this together, in which case maybe the unconditionality, so in the former case you want a very targeted kind of a system. In the latter case, it's exactly unconditionality you want, because the people who are disrupted by a pandemic is all of us, or could be all of us at any moment, right? Or you can't predict who it will be from one week to the next. So if you believe that, then clearly you feel that an unconditional system is the way forward, because any attempt to identify the subgroup of people you're trying to help will be hopelessly sort of behind times and wrong, because the pandemic could be making anyone have a bad moment at any time. So I sort of whizzed through that, but I hope it's been all right. In these samples, universal basic income is very popular, despite the widespread view that it's a politically unsaleable policy. And I think that has historically been the view. And I wonder if that's actually changing a little bit. The Scottish nationalists are flirting with it. The Labour Party in this country is flirting with it. The Democratic Party in America is having is holding hands with it, but not going all the way, I think. And I certainly don't expect it from Joe Biden, but there are other people like Andrew Yang in the Democratic Party who've made cases for this policy. It's a policy, by the way, which has a lot of history in the USA, but that's a talk for another day. What we found is that in these samples, the pandemic has increased support for UBI, both absolutely and also when compared to an equally generous targeted alternative in these samples. And by doing a within individual comparison of thinking about normal times versus thinking about now, we can kind of get a metric of that. These shifts are, however, attenuating over time, and they've already declined by 1/3 since the peak. Now, what that means, if your effect is declining by 1/3 every 6 months, then in 18 months, you've got no effect left at all. So it's sort of interesting, because if you believe that politicians have windows of opportunities to do things, that kind of, in a funny way, tells you a bit about how big those windows might be, right? So if in April you could have sold the world any policy, by September, you've kind of already lost 1/3 of that political, window of opportunity. It's sort of an interesting thing. I would actually like to track this more over time and see in 2 years, is it back to zero? Because politicians certainly believe that timing is a lot in politics, and that things that seem politically impossible can in certain windows be not just politically possible, but actually politically inevitable. I think the interesting thing for me as someone interested in social cognition is that people's support for UBI is actually systematically related to a network of beliefs they hold about what pros and cons are important. So they seem to be able to represent that there are some good things about the feature and about the policy and some bad ones. And according to how they subjectively weight those things, their support for UBIs, sort of falls out. Of course, it could be the other way around, that they know how much they support UBI and then they rationalize how important the various things that are obviously true of it must be to them. But whichever way around, people have a whole network of beliefs, not just, I know I like this, but I don't know why. And what the pandemic has done is change the importance of some of those pros and cons in people's minds, which for us is really interesting, because I sort of outlined that kind of overall model that we have of political opinion formation, in which situational factors, sort of feed in real time and really change the task that people see the policy is trying to solve, because they change, what society is having to grapple with. So it's a kind of nice test of our general approach, and it's, as I say, it's very consistent with the kind of work that we were doing on hypothetical societies before this all blew up. And then, just that final point I made, that there's a window of opportunity in the aftermath of events, right? Maybe it's 18 months, right? If you're losing a third of your effect every 6 months, and certainly, you think about the major changes in welfare policy in this and other countries often relate to wars or depressions or these kinds of events, during which people are suddenly able to say, well, all kinds of things that, we might have thought of doing, but were just too difficult. And now, now we can suddenly do them, and often do them on an absolutely massive, mind-blowing scale that would have just seemed unthinkable a year or two earlier. Just leave you with a quote by Milton Friedman, who by the way, is someone who's a slightly important figure in the history of the universal basic income, or really of the negative income tax anyway, which is a related policy. He says, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And I think he's right about that. And it'll be interesting to sort of see to what extent political change in different countries does actually follow from this pandemic. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And he says that, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And so in a sense, there's a view here of what the point of kind of intellectuals is not necessarily that, we can cause political change. Maybe it's exogenous events that largely cause political change. It's just that we can kind of actually discuss what kinds of alternatives, in the universe might be possible. And then, when the winds blow, it rearranges the cards, and but it can only rearrange the cards that were on the table. So it's just a little kind of thought to end with. So that's what I had to present. Eric, I guess we go over to questions now.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. I found that really interesting. I'd just like to take advantage of being the chair. Just it's part question, part comment, really. I just wanted to say, Daniel, that I just really enjoyed the paper from a point of view not only of someone just jobbing social scientist, but in terms of what the ESS tries to do. I thought in many ways, it's very much a paper about measurement, isn't it? And it's also a paper about context. And one of the things that the ESS did at its start was to have this idea that we would try in some way to always archive, or at least record somewhere, the sorts of things that were going on during fieldwork periods. Mm. And as a methodologist, you're sort of always a bit torn, because on the one hand, the worst thing you can imagine is a major event that disrupts fieldwork from an operational point of view, but obviously from the analyst's point of view, something that hugely it disrupts society happening in the midst of fieldwork is also fascinating. So I think it's always our relief that the fact that we hadn't quite gone into the field, got ready going into the field, is sort of offset by the possibility of what contextual opportunities that might have given us.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that also an interesting way of also getting at some of these issues is to ask people, which I know the ESS does, and also there are other sort of cross-national data sets out there that do this, that it's important to ask people what their perception of the situation is, right? I mean, so with the pandemic, that this is not perhaps a great example, but for example, there's a big literature on whether, and we've looked at experimentally about whether society being perceived as well. So here's a good example. When people believe that social outcomes are due mainly to luck rather than effort, they're more in favor of redistribution. So that you can sort of get at that two ways. One, you could try to ask for different countries, can we really find out how much outcomes are due to luck? Can we use metrics of things like social mobility as sort of proxies for that? The other thing is just to ask the people, as well as asking them, what do you favor? How much redistribution do you favor? You ask them, to what extent do you think outcomes in your society are due to luck? And when you do that, you actually find big differences between countries that explain a bunch of variation in things like their support for redistribution. So yeah, I mean, our approach is very different in a way, but I also think we're getting at issues you can also get at with the ESS.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll start taking some of the questions that we've got in the window. So a question from Gillian. Interesting to see so much support for UBI. You said that your sample was slightly left-leaning, but was there support for UBI even in the right-leaning participants?
Well, there wasn't zero. And sorry, I'm doing that annoying thing of flicking back through slides. But so this is study one, and this is, remember, in study one, it's just UBI is not set against any alternative. Sorry, you're still seeing my screen, aren't you? That in study one, UBI is not set against any alternative, and we do find a left-right gradient, quite a clear one, particularly in the USA. And I think that's because people who see themselves on the right in the USA may not really be in favor of any particular, they may be just against welfare schemes full stop. But come the pandemic, that's still, even at the sort of right end of that distribution in the US, that's still up at sort of 60 or something for pandemic times. In the study two, we get a much less clear left-right gradient. Because it may well be people on the right don't much like UBI, but they don't much like targeted welfare schemes either. And so when they might really be choosing between two things, neither of which they're very enthusiastic about. And in fact, there is a tradition on the right of favouring things like UBI and flat taxes and stuff like that because they're not progressive, right? They don't the rich would get them too. So in a sense, when you set UBI against targeting, and people on the left seem to like both UBI and targeting, and people on the right dislike them both. So when you set the two against each other, it's not quite clear which will win, and you don't get a very clear left-right gradient. But yeah, the levels of support are super high, I must say. Our participants are mainly fairly young, and that might be something to do with it. But yeah.
So a methodological question from Isabel, and this was one that was in my mind too. In the study one, was there any balanced order of the questions about support for UBI with and without a pandemic? I think Isabel is implying, did you rotate the order in which you asked, or was it always before and after?
It was always before and after. I mean, we did think about that, but that particular one, it just sort of seemed, well, we didn't, is the short answer. I mean, one could. Yeah. Other things we did, so all of these advantages and disadvantages, we randomized the order, which I don't think probably made much difference, but that particular one we didn't, simply because the sort of way the survey went, it sort of said, right, first think about, as if the pandemic hadn't happened, and then here's your questions. But now, remember that it has happened, and we could have done that the other way around. You're quite right. It's a thing you could do, but we haven't done that.
Yeah. Okay, a question from Charlotte. Thanks for the great talk. I'm interested in the importance of the encourages irresponsibility factor. It seems to be negatively predictive. Yeah. Could you give more details of how you define this in the study? And do you think that it's related to the luck aspect in your cognition paper?
Well, that's a really, I wish I had that wording in front of me, but by the time I pulled it up on my computer, I would have lost you. But we did say it wasn't just those 4 words. I mean, the item was a bit longer, and I think it had so it said something like people might spend it on gambling or alcohol, something like that. I forget it was gambling or drugs or gambling or alcohol, but it's something that is sort of discussed as a concern, that if you just give people money for nothing, they'll spend it all on drink and drugs or on gambling. And that's kind of discussed quite a lot, particularly for big things like the Alaska Permanent Fund payment, which is not regular small doses, but a really big annual sum. And there is some evidence that people do go on binges with it and stuff like that. So it was somewhat of a surprise to me that was a negative predictor, and indeed the strongest negative predictor of support. But I guess what people are thinking is that in a targeted system, you somehow, you can really assess the people and make sure that they really need it, and they're not just, going out to spend it all on drink or drugs. I mean, I think that's a fantasy. I think it's very hard to tell what people are going to do with money you give them, and with all the targeting in the world, you can never actually really be sure. But that seems to be the kind of a concern there. As I say, there was a slightly fuller wording, but I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it was.
Okay, thanks. A question from Hazel, which again was another one that's at the back of my mind. Do you have any plans to continue to track this? Although normality has started to creep in with threat of second waves, spikes, etc., might we see attitudes swinging back? And do you have any ideas where you'd like to take the research next, or generally?
Well, so the tracking, I wasn't particularly in favour of doing, because really, to track this well, you'd need a panel, a panel study, and we didn't set that up. I mean, I looking back now, I curse it really, because I'd really like to go back to the very same people. I mean, I sampled again from the same pool, and that's okay, but to go back to the very same people would be much, much stronger. I'd love to do that. I really would, actually. And for just running those little extra surveys this week for this talk made me think, oh, why haven't I been doing this? What have I been doing the last few months? I could have been, kind of setting this up more systematically. I think what I regret is, so in both of these studies, we asked people, how much have you been personally affected by the pandemic? And actually, mostly that was pretty high. Mostly it was a lot. But in a way, to do this well, you'd really want to ask a lot of questions about exactly how people have been affected. Had they been furloughed? Had they lost their job? Had they been medically affected? Had people in their family been medically affected? It was, were the impacts that they saw mainly economic or mainly medical, and these kinds of things. So, if I were to do this well, I'd have to go back in time for 6 months and set all that up, and then try and track those things over time. Because what I wonder is if there's a shift as the kind of, this could get any one of us at any moment. We've just got to all stop worrying about having to earn our living and, just get something unconditional for now, to actually different people are really at different risks and in different ways. And also people may have intuitions now that what starts to matter is really the economy more. Certainly that seemed to be happening back in August. And then now that the cases are going up again, people are getting a bit more concerned about the sort of medical aspects again. So I would love to track all that. As I say, this was an opportune thing. We just did these studies really quickly in April and May, and perhaps we didn't set them up as richly as we could have done. And I can't sort of reinvent that now. But what I might do minimally, because it's a very simple thing to do, is just do the update every 6 months that I've shown you here. I mean, that would be something, right? I mean, just check that through. I still don't think it will be the perfect system. What I haven't done is in the update, looked at the more detailed things like the weights given to these simplicity of administration versus not leading to a responsibility. So I haven't redone that. I just did the headline questions again.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. That this sort of thing you allude to, of sort of how much skin you have in the game in terms of these big events. I think there's a difference, isn't there, between when it seems to be affecting everybody, and then as if it does become sort of much more variegated.
Yeah.
Then it would be possible, wouldn't it, to have virtually very little experience of sort of high numbers of deaths or restrictions, or even economic damage is going to be variegated as well. that could really differ, couldn't it, simply between localities and regions? So
absolutely, absolutely, in different groups of people. I mean, there's something very odd about this whole pandemic thing in terms of most people's experience. You know, I mean, I personally, for example, have not really known anyone who's been ill, or, you know, actually as a university lecturer, not really been in, I mean, you know, my income hasn't dried up. My firm is not going to, well, actually, I'm going to say my firm is not going to go bust. I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, I assume my firm is not going to go bust. My salary's not changed, and I've not known anyone who's been ill. So it's kind of been a weird thing. And the way my cognition about its impact is not really my personal experience. It's more representations I see flying around of what's happening to other people. So, so as people gain more first-hand experience, that's going to, over time, become really variegated according to your age and where you live and what kind of job you do and stuff. So I think all of, you know, sort of unpacking how that pans out would be really, really interesting. And I suspect, and again, this would be nice to have studied more systematically from the start. I expect in the very early stages of this, maybe that's what that David Graeber quote is about. Everyone seems to be having the same experience and everyone is responding the same way. And kind of as it goes on, that sort of braids into everyone starts to have slightly different experiences. And then the cleavages emerge in how people think we should respond. And then people start to have really different views on what the appropriate social response is. So I hope people are tracking all this stuff. You know, I've not really been doing it, but there's a job to be done there for sure.
Thank you. We do have time for another question. Are you aware of any, is it possible to look at data that is similar or different from any government statistics of people's opinions? Are there any larger surveys that you're aware of, probably not looking at as many different aspects of this, but just broadly speaking, are you aware of how your work fits in with that of others?
Well, so we did compare the, I mean, although I said to you that I don't think that the absolute levels of support are the strongest feature of our studies because these weren't representative samples. It's more, you know, the shifts in people's cognition when they start to think about the pandemic that I think is of note. We did compare the ESS data for Britain, you know, to try and get a benchmark with this very high level of support for UBI we're seeing. You know, is it sort of completely outlandish? And actually, it's higher than. I mean, it's up there with the most supportive ESS countries. But there are countries where the level of support is about what we see here for normal times, right? But when our participants are talking about normal times, it looks a bit on the high side. So to some extent, you can triangulate it that way. I think, so I'm someone who's always doing things in rather a rush without really understanding them very well. And the consequence is I never use the same measurement instruments as other people. So my 9 and 16 important features are completely sort of homespun and, were sort of thought of in about a week, which is a failing in me really, because then it turns out that someone else will have 7 or 4 and there'll be different ones. And then of course, you can't really do the comparison, but a lot of these kind of things have been studied, how important is fairness, what is perceived as fair. And so you can to some extent triangulate, but I haven't used a standard module, and that has the benefit that I've been able to ask the questions I was interested in, but of course the cost that always has, that you can't, your data are then not, they don't build on other data in a useful way.
Yeah, the eternal trade-offs.
The eternal trade-off indeed, yeah.
Well, I don't see any further questions in the chat window, so I'll just take this opportunity to thank Daniel very much for a very interesting talk, and I thought you also gave us some very interesting answers to the questions from the audience as well. So thank you very much for sharing that work with us.